Welcome to session number 7 of Introduction to Worldviews and Apologetics. This session, we're going to look at a thing called, I don't think very graciously, but it's called finite godism. We're going to look at how that goes. Let me shift over to the screen. Let me see here. That's what I'm going to try to share. Whoops, there it is. Finite godism, which is the belief in a world with a finite God instead of an infinite God who is all powerful. We have a real God who created, sort of, and it really cares about people more or less, and is actually a loving God, but he can't do much about it. Harold Kushner is an example of finite godism, and we'll get to him at the end of this lecture today. He's an American rabbi, a very liberal fellow, but has written a very, very popular book. He's actually written several very, very popular books. When Bad Things Happen to Good People. It's very encouraging, actually. The book is well written, and Kushner himself sounds like a really nice guy. I'll introduce him a little later, but this quote is key to understanding what we mean by a finite God. Kushner says, "Are you capable of forgiving and loving God even when you found out that he's not perfect? Even when he's let you down and disappointed you by permitting bad luck and sickness and cruelty in his world, by permitting some of these things to happen to you, can you learn to love and forgive him despite his limitations?" Okay, you can hear some of what's going on there. Finite Godism, the idea that God is less than infinite, less than perfect, is the belief in a God who's doing his best but has serious limits. And it's logically built on the ancient problem of evil. The book of Job, actually, roughly 4,000 years ago, answered this problem. There's no need to keep beating it up. Nevertheless, non-Christians continue to hash and rehash the problem of evil. Yeah, the system, finite godism, tries to solve the problem of evil without throwing God out, and that's about the best you can say for it. The logic looks like this. And this is the classic logical problem of evil. If God were all powerful, he could destroy evil. And of course, he could. If God were all good, he would destroy evil. That's the second point. And that is, in fact, the crux of the issue. Later on in this series, we're going to come back and answer the problem of evil. Because I actually think that's a fairly important question. If God were all good, he would destroy evil. So say the atheists and the deists and all kinds of others who argue from the problem of evil. Because 3, evil has not been destroyed. We pretend to have some kind of a universal standard of what is evil and what is not, even though there is no all-powerful God who could make such laws. But by our definition, evil hasn't been destroyed. There it is. And by biblical standards, of course, evil has not been destroyed. So we as Christians do have a problem here, and we have to answer this question. The fourth logical movement here is unique to finite godism. Therefore, either God does not exist or he is limited. But there is evidence that God exists. So this is what the finite godism movement or school of thought would argue. I say there's evidence that God exists. You look at the creation, it need not exist, but there it is. Something has brought all of this into being. And on that point, they're right. There is, in fact, evidence that God exists. But because evil also exists, therefore, God is limited. And so this is the argument for a finite God. And frankly, I could take 10 minutes and destroy this for you, but it isn't necessary. Let's take a look at it because it's a very, very widespread viewpoint. You'll find lots and lots of people who have maybe read some book like Kushner's book or any of a number of others that I'll introduce. And this is their viewpoint. God could destroy evil, but he hasn't, and therefore he must be some kind of a limited God. He's just a little God, not a big G God. Okay, so there are lots of variations on the theme. Finite Godism is not a religious system. In other words, you don't go to the church of a finite God. This is a non-Christian worldview. It is typically a non-religious worldview that, in fact, many Christians have adopted because they don't know any better. They've never been taught. It is similar in a lot of ways to atheism because it begins with the argument from evil. The argument from evil is easily defeated, but it keeps coming back because, frankly, the atheists and the deists and the finite godists don't read very widely. they don't. They've never read the book of Job, for example, so they don't know. It's similar to panentheism and pantheism in the sense that there is a limited God out there, or kind of a non-personal God. But on the one hand, God is not the world, like pantheism, nor is he one pole of the world, like in panentheism. Like deism, except in the deist worldview, in spite of the fact that God has chosen not to do anything in the world, he is all powerful. The deist position died out because it's irrational to believe that a genuinely all-powerful God who had gone to the trouble of creating a universe would walk away from it. That's not sensible. And so to a large extent, deism just died out. There's some other reasons. The central thrust of all of the versions of finite godism is that God is severely limited. He's not infinite in any real way. He's a spiritual being who exists outside of the world. He does have some relationships inside of the world, but he's very, very limited. He is personal, not simply a force. And he has no real plan to deal with the evil in the universe that he created. He just can't handle it. We're going to look at a variety of the most famous of the finite God writers. And believe it or not, they're very, very common. They're all over the place. We'll start with an American author from 100 years ago, William James, who is he's a pragmatist, a philosopher, sociologist of religion, I believe is the most important thing we could say about him. And the term pragmatist means that he cared about whether or not a system works, whether or not what you're doing works. So who cares what the theoretical principle of an internal combustion engine is? Does it work? And if it does, then it's a good thing. It's just fine. And so if you're doing some kind of a religious system and it works for you, makes you happy, he's perfectly okay with that. William James wrote, among other things, The Variety of Religious Experience. And his test was, is your religion doing what you want it to do? Does it make you feel good? James himself probably had no particular religious feelings at all. He felt like his job was to try to figure out why religious people behave the way they do. So his was a sociological thing. James comes from a background of generally skepticism, goes all the way back to Hume and Kant. And he would say that truth is not inherent in any particular objective way. So if you can see me in the little thing, I'm holding up a cup of coffee. Let's see if I can get it in the screen. Oh, my coffee cup doesn't show up. Now it does. There's my coffee cup. So my coffee cup does in fact exist. I can feel the weight of it here in my hand because it still has coffee in it. And so as I drink a little bit of my coffee, the objective reality is that I have this invisible cup of coffee in my hand. Isn't that fun? Kind of a strange thing. James would say, whether the coffee cup exists or not is entirely up to you. If you believe that the coffee cup is there and contains coffee and that works for you, then for you, that's true. It may not be true for anybody else. Truth is different for different people at different times. This is very common amongst the finite Godists. We're going to find, in fact, that there's a very common philosophical strain in the modern world. Over the past 150 years or so, we've moved toward a general consensus in the broad non-Christian world that truth is relative. It depends on what you happen to think at the moment. Nothing else matters. Believe that life is worth living, and your belief will help create the fact. Okay, so your life really isn't worth living, but if you think it is, it'll be okay. I'm not sure that that's helpful. Okay, for James, the best God is a finite God, such a God, a little God who doesn't really handle everything, avoids the hallowed, unreal God of scholastic theology. Well, who is that? That's the God of the Bible, the theistic God, or some unintelligible pantheistic monster. Here he's attacking Hinduism and Buddhism. And I think probably correctly. All the evidence we have seems to me to sweep us very strongly toward the belief in some form of superhuman life with which we may, unknown to ourselves, be conscious. What's he saying? He's saying there's some kind of a God out there. We see the creation, we see the design of the world, we see the evidence of moral imperatives. So it seems like there's some kind of a God out there. However, he says, such a God need not be infinite. It, not he, but it need not be solitary. Solitary in the sense of one God. So James is actually just fine with polytheism, but for most of his works, he talks about just a single God. The most famous book that he wrote was published in 1902, 100 years ago. It's still in print. Still a wide variety of editions of this thing have come out. It continues to be sold on the Christian book sites. It is an absolutely non-Christian book. It's not the slightest bit biblical or useful to Christians. I just want you to know that. But this one is very, very popular, and it's in a lot of pastors' libraries because it's cheap, and sometimes it is good for illustrations. Um, This is a quote from Varieties of Religious Experience. Okay. Who knows whether the faithfulness of individuals here below to their own poor overbeliefs may not actually help God in turn to be more effectively faithful to his own greater tasks. So our own poor overbeliefs. We believe God is powerful. And of course he's not, James is teaching us. But we help him along. It maybe gives him a little encouragement to buck up and try harder next time. He's an underachiever. He's doing the best he can to manage a C- in geometry. But with a little help from his friends, maybe he'll pick up on that. What a crazy thing. James admitted that his view could lead to a kind of polytheism, but he thought that would be a good thing. But he said all it really requires is a God who is other and larger. Okay, other meaning superhuman, and large enough to create the universe, but not necessarily infinite. Okay. In general, William James felt that all religions were the same at their core, the belief in an other larger power. So Hinduism, Christianity, Buddhism, Mormonism, Islam, they're all the same basically because they believe that there's something out there. And that's all that they agree on, but that's enough. The differences in religious doctrine between Christianity and Hinduism, for example, are due to the faithful believing too much. So if you believe that God is triune, there's a Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you're believing way too much. Yeah, according to William James. Okay, let's look at some of the elements of this. Get beyond God. James was opposed to a pantheistic worldview and a materialistic worldview. Didn't believe either would work. The world is not just matter, he said. There are obviously spiritual elements. It is also not pure spirit. But the theistic concept of a God separate from his creation, James says right here, is just nonsense. That's his argument. So when we come to miracles, which is very common in the non-Christian religions, miracles simply don't happen. They can't happen. It's impossible. According to James, the concept that God might actually interact with mankind on a personal basis and handle problems at the individual level is just grotesque. This quote I really like because it says what he really means. He was convinced that God handled the laws of nature. Okay, so he makes sure that physics works, that gravity affects everything correctly, and that nuclear reactions happen on schedule, all of that sort of thing. Yeah, so he operates on a wholesale level. He takes the big stuff, but he never works at retail. That means he doesn't do little things. Also, he doesn't do infinitely great things. So according to William James, the creation had nothing to do with making something out of nothing. That would require a miracle. Instead, God took what he found and rearranged things to make it a bit better. Miracles in the world of William James cannot happen, simply cannot happen. In some way, although William James rejects the idea, his view is very similar to pantheism, where God is like the soul in the body, the force that derives from all living things. There is no personal interaction, just a correlation of forces. Okay. William James did believe that evil was a real thing because as a finite godist. He rejects the idea that evil is an illusion. It is the reason that he has to come up with a finite God. As to ethics or morality, James taught relativism. Obviously, if every religion is essentially the same and religions teach different standards of morality, then morality and ethics are relative. Situational ethics, we call this. No one can ever dogmatically predict what will be right or wrong. That's subjectively determined in the event itself and is always situational. William James is dogmatic about the relativity of ethics. Yeah. He said absolutely, positively, ethics can't be known for sure. Nothing can be known for sure. That's of course, a self-defeating statement. If it's true that nothing can be known for sure, then even that statement can't be known for sure and is probably false. What do you do with that? Okay, well, how about man? James believed that man is something more than material, even though he evolved from lower life forms. He has arrived at a higher form of life, which now includes immortality, which is nice because now we have medicines that make us immortal, which would be nice if it were true, but of course it's not. William James, like most non-Christian philosophers, all of the worldviews outside of Christianity hold to evolution as an explanation for the existence of mankind and other kinds of life. Typically, the evolutionists teach that everything evolved out of an original chaos. We've got everything. What happens to people over a period of life? I picked a photograph of Mother Teresa in Calcutta taking care of a baby, because William James thought that there is in fact such a thing as good and evil. He was a pragmatist, and he believed that it was possible for the world to continually improve, but that wouldn't necessarily happen. He rejected both the idea of universal salvation, which is a good thing because the Bible doesn't teach universal salvation, and universal destruction, also a good thing because the Bible doesn't teach that either. He felt that at least some good people could be saved, and I put air quotes around that, because salvation for him really wasn't something he would define. He most likely would agree that Mother Teresa was a good person. And how do we know that Mother Teresa was a good person? Well, subjectively, she did things that most of us would say, "Ooh, I couldn't do that. I don't have the discipline." So she must be a good person. Is Mother Teresa saved? Actually, I don't know. I rather hope so because I like her model. But salvation is based on the work of the Spirit of God, not on a list of good works. But William James was a pragmatist. He said some people are really good. So there's probably something in the future for them. It's nice of him to give us that little bit. Let's go on to another more recent guy, died in 1989. He's a philosophy professor. He was a disciple of a character named Edgar Brightman, and a proponent of what has been called personal idealism. This is a very Western form of finite godism. Brightman died in 1953, and Bertocci succeeded him as the chair of the philosophy department at Boston University. So this is a philosophy professor. He's got his PhD from Duke University. He's definitely a non-Christian philosophy professor. I kind of like him because he's got this great Italian name. I mean, with a name like Bertocci, what's not to like? A good guy. So what does he have to say about God in his introduction to the philosophy of religion? If you title a book "The Introduction to the Philosophy of Religion," you can be certain that it has nothing to do with what the Bible teaches. So this is Bertocci, who I assume was born and grew up in a Roman Catholic home. But I don't know that. God is, according to Bertocci, the cosmic mind who guides the development of all things. This God is all good, but not all powerful. Now, where did he get that? Well, again, he goes back to the problem of evil. God is not necessarily good. Okay, we use the word necessarily there in the philosophic sense. A thing that is logically necessary cannot be otherwise. So water is wet. It is necessarily wet. If it's not wet, well, it could be cold or, okay, well, never mind that. Gravity necessarily brings things down. Well, even that isn't true. But some things are necessarily so. The equal sign always means the same thing. God, however, is not necessarily good. He simply chooses to be good. Isn't that nice about him? In spite of the fact that he chooses to be good, there's very little that he can do about evil. He's not all powerful. He's good, but not all powerful. To assume that a good and powerful God would not allow evil, Bertocci has had to be either unaware of or he has rejected without giving the reasons the arguments of Christian philosophers over the past 2,000 years. Augustine and Aquinas and the rest of them have done this. Gottfried Leibniz in the 18th century during the Enlightenment came up with a great answer to the question. The book of Job has a good answer to the question. And in fact, the question has long since been answered. And if God is good, he would in fact do something. And the Bible, which Bertocci seems to be unaware of, announces God's program to deal with evil in the world. But according to Brother Bertocci, God can't do much about it. This quote says a lot of it. To suppose that the highest intelligence we know would find some sort of delight or self-fulfillment in allowing unnecessary human suffering or animal pain, if he could do something about it, is to reject everything we know about the nature of wisdom. Christians do not teach that God takes delight in suffering. Christians do not teach that there is unnecessary suffering. Christians do not take delight in animal pain. God, of course, could do something about it, but for Bertocci to say that God has done nothing and can do nothing is simply wrong. He's allowing evil in the world today, but there is an answer ultimately. Anyway, that's back in 1953. That's still a very persuasive book in the world today. So God is intelligent, but he's not omniscient. He really doesn't know what's coming next. He can't predict the future. He's personal in the sense of having some kind of consciousness capable of reason, some kind of moral obligation. He's got free will. He's got ideals. He'd like things to turn out well, but it most of the time doesn't work the way he had hoped. Okay, let's look at what he teaches about the world. God is the ultimate cause of the universe. So we can say that he is the why of all that exists. The how is answered by evolution, of course. All of the non-Christian worldviews agree that evolution is the only possibility for the existence of things. Bertocci finds the idea that God created out of himself, which is pantheism, or out of pre-existing materials, which would be atheism, to be irrational. And that's wise of him to reject both of those. He is left with a creation out of nothing, but he doesn't seem to be happy with that. We never see Bertocci approaching a creation out of nothing. He always goes back to evolution. That's an inconsistency. How about evil? Despite the fact that an all-good God created the universe does actually contain evil. And Bertocci is correct on that point. There is evil in the world. Ultimately, Bertocci tells us, this is traceable to a given in God's nature. A given is one of those philosophical terms. When you actually, it's a mathematical term in geometry. Here are your givens. Evil is simply a given. It's going to be a part of God's nature, like the yin and the yang in this diagram on the right. Everything is a part of the one. And in this, Bertocci is actually, in spite of his protestations, bowing the knee to pantheism. There's nothing God can do about it. Evil is simply a part of what God is. It's like natural laws, which, and this is an important point, God didn't create. He simply lives with these natural laws. So natural laws like gravity and mathematics and physics and whatnot have nothing to do with God. They were simply there before he arrived. He didn't create them. They also don't reflect any part of God's character. God simply lives with natural laws, and one of the natural laws is evil. And that evil is a part of God's nature. Okay, according to Bertocci, some evil has a valuable purpose. And in that, he's reflecting medieval Christian apologists who were right. Sometimes evil does have a valuable purpose. Sometimes men suffer evil because of their errors. And suffering evil because of an error is a good way to learn to avoid errors in the future. You don't touch a hot stove twice because you suffer the pain of a bad decision. If every time I exceeded the speed limit here in Idaho, I got a ticket for it and had to pay the fine, I would be more careful with my speed. Okay, so sometimes evil has a valuable purpose. Sometimes we learn from them. Some evil teaches us, by contrast, to value the good, and I think that's also true. But, Bertocci says, some evil is purposeless, and God just has to live with it. He really can't fix it. And of course, he has no plan to do anything. He can't predict the future anyway, so even if he did think he could do something about it, he probably wouldn't bother because it's just too much effort. I suppose it's hard to figure out how people work. Um, the Christian response to the problem of evil does allow that some evil has a valuable purpose, and evil teaches us to contrast the good. But it's wrong to say that all evil is purposeless. God is much bigger than Bertocci gives him credit for. Okay, where's man going? Okay, man is the result of evolution, of course. Everybody is so sure of that. However, he is more than the random combination of physical properties. He's also rational as well as free and purposeful. Man's mind, according to Bertocci, is irreducible. It's not a product of the brain or the body. So Bertocci held that because of that, uh, because of the spirituality of the mind, man will live on after death. But this afterlife is not a reward for goodness in life. The afterlife is bestowed on those whom God thinks are capable of developing in a worthy manner. So once we lose our bodies, we go on developing our minds afterwards somehow. And he never goes anywhere with this. That's simply where he leaves it. Okay, ethics. This is kind of an interesting thing. Bertocci is one of the few in the finite godism camp who actually tries to struggle with the problem of ethics. For Bertocci, ethics are not entirely situational. He says man is not only free and rational, he is also moral. There's a moral nature in man. Now, where does this come from? He evolved that way? I don't know, whatever. The universe, according to Bertocci, has a moral order which man cannot break with impunity. And again, we need to ask. And Bertocci either doesn't ask this or doesn't answer it. Where did that moral order come from? It certainly doesn't come from God, because God just has to live with things. The moral order is a fundamental law, is a fundamental moral law for all men, a law which is consistent with their nature as creative, rational being. And these universals are not separate from human experience, but arise out of human love and freedom. Bertocci seems to believe that men are essentially good. The human love and freedom worldwide, universally, produce a kind of universal ethical base. So the ethics are not absolute, but they're also not relative. So he tries to argue against ethical and moral relativity by saying that the ethics are universal because all men share them. Now, in some important ways, he's correct. C.S. Lewis has noted that the moral imperatives seem to be universal among human cultures and across time. So he's right, but he gives the wrong answer. Bertocci, again, ignores the biblical account and assumes that men, being perfectly good, have ethical standards that, while not absolute, are universal. And they're not given by God. They don't reflect God's perfections. Rather, God is measured by the universal good and evil standards of men. Okay, well, where's all of this going? Who knows? There is no ultimate or assured goal in human history, according to Bertocci. God is finite, and thus he cannot achieve everything he plans. Yet God is unwavering in his struggle to make the best of every situation. Best, by the way, by Bertocci's standard, by this so-called universal human standard. So God doesn't seem to be living up to my expectations today. He must be having a bad day. Okay, there is hope though. God has not always been successful, as the extinction of species in the evolutionary process suggests. He has, however, managed to control the non-rational part of his nature rather than be controlled by it. Good for God. The given evil is not running wild. Despite obstacles, God finds ways to avoid blind alleys and final defeat. God's past record of achievement gives us hope that he will probably continue. That's a damning by faint praise, if nothing else. At any rate, that's Brother Bertocci. Harold Kushner, this fella, I tried to get a photograph with his yarmulke on, and he doesn't seem to wear a yarmulke, even when he's in the synagogue. I'm not sure why. At any rate, he's still alive, as long retired. His most important books, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, and When All You've Ever Wanted Isn't Enough. He's one of the most popular versions of finite godism that is available in the English language. I know he's been translated into European languages, and so this is a very broad influence. This is also a book that is broadly quoted by Christian sources, or so-called Christian sources. It is definitely a non-Christian view. And it's not a good answer to the problem of evil. But again, Kushner starts out with the problem of evil. Okay, according to Kushner, there is one God. He's Jewish, of course, he's a rabbi, so he's pretty much stuck with one God. But his view of what one God means is rather strange. According to Kushner, there is one God who is limited in both power and perfection. And I like this quote. I disagree with it, but I like the quote. When we speak of one God, we're not taking a census. Okay, well, it's not necessary to take a census. God is one. We are saying something like, God has it all together. God has got his act together. Is that really what we mean when we say God is one? Well, that's not what Christians mean. That is not what Jews mean either. So Kushner would have to be thought of as a non-Orthodox Jew. According to Harold Kushner, God would be lonely out there without a creation. In eternity past, he must have been very lonely, just him. Nobody to talk to. Nobody in his cell phone contact list. Poor God. He cannot be all powerful, Rabbi Kushner says, because his creation shares some of that power. God is limited in what he can do by the physical laws of nature. Okay, the creation, where we'll talk about creation here in just a second, has physical laws which limit God. God absolutely can't violate the laws of nature, which of course makes miracles impossible. And evil is always getting in the way, and creation keeps on evolving. But God, it gives God a full-time job just keeping up with the chaos and trying to make something acceptable out of it. So you've got this picture of God as a one-armed paper hanger trying to get the job done, but all he's got is chaos all around him and a bunch of troublesome creatures who just can't be governed and don't like the idea of going along with the program. Okay, so God is more a God of love than of power. He is the force that helps us rise above selfishness to help our neighbor. He inspires us to reach up, to aspire to goodness, to dare to be heroic, because God does that. He's always trying to better himself. He's always trying to be a better God. He's always thinking of doing heroic things, although he never really gets around to it. But we should help our neighbors because God is a loving God, in spite of the fact that he doesn't have the power to do anything about it. So a very limited God. What about man? Okay, so man is a part of creation, and each man is made in God's image. What does that mean? When Kushner speaks of creation, of course, he doesn't mean direct creation. He doesn't mean that God created man, certainly not creation out of nothing, which is what the book of Genesis teaches. Evolution is the means by which God's creativity is expressed. Okay, so God created through evolution. As for the world is in a process of change, but there are things about the world that even God can't change. As my son Stephen would say when looking at a page of calculus like this, he would say, you can see very clearly, it's inescapable that g to the p equals 1.13 times 10 to the 28. Okay. God would look at that and say, well, yeah, it's obvious. There's nothing I can do about that. God can't change these things. The laws of physics, the laws of nature, the laws of mathematics simply exist. They evolved in this way, and God can't do anything about it. And so, of course, he can't answer prayer. He could never possibly do a miracle. For the Israelites to cross the Red Sea would require a miracle, therefore it didn't happen. For Jesus to be resurrected from the dead would require a miracle, therefore it didn't happen. It couldn't happen. Since God didn't create the world, its laws are external to and superior to God. That's a very important concept. This is shared by the entire non-Christian world. God can't do anything about it. God would have to violate a law of nature. And obviously, you stupid Christians think that you've got a God who can violate laws. No God is outside the law. Excuse me. There is a God who makes laws. And we have to live with that. Okay, I'm going to take care of business over here. What about the problem of evil? And again, Rabbi Kushner says, evil is real. To be alive is to feel pain. The world is unjust. It really is. Rather than blaming God, we need to forgive God. And then here comes this quotation. Are you capable of forgiving and loving God even when you have found he is not perfect, even when he has let you down and disappointed you by permitting bad luck and sickness and cruelty in his world and allowing some of these things to happen to you? Can you learn to love and forgive him despite his limitations? Okay, that's an encouragement to love God in spite of the fact that he's just not much of a God. So what does this tell us about ethics? Kushner is not an ethicist. Kushner seems to hold that although God is the lawgiver and his law imposes a moral obligation, that this level of morality is only for the immature. So there is some kind of God-given law, but that's only for immature people. It's as though he understands God's law as a kind of rule book for beginners. The goal of ethics, according to Rabbi Kushner, is to become a person who evaluates a changing society and makes laws that will ensure a fair and just society. That's modern liberalism. That's what here in America we've had a problem with Supreme Court justices who believe that society changes, laws need to change to keep up with the changing times. We need to ensure a fair and just society, and if people believe that men can become pregnant, then we need to make laws that allow for that. Because everything changes all the time. There are no ultimate truths. Kushner would say inconsistently that God is the lawgiver and there is a moral obligation, but the higher law is that imposed by our own changing morals and ethics. There's nothing permanent. Okay. What about life after death? On this, the good rabbi is uncertain. Personal immortality, he says, is only a hope. Neither I nor any living person can know anything about the reality of that hope. Our real immortality is here, to have children, to plant trees and gardens that others can enjoy after we are gone. Okay, so there's our immortality. Heaven and hell are right here on earth. Heaven is having learned to do and to enjoy the things that make us human. The worst hell is not fire and brimstone, but the realization that you could have been a real human being. And now it's too late. Okay, and that's kind of encouraging, but it's not true. Rabbi Kushner writes very well. His books are actually a really good read, and they're very encouraging, but they're not true. They're extremely popular and have gone into multiple printings. They're all over the world, but they're not true. Let's summarize finite Godism, just some basic stuff. First of all, God is finite in power and or love. He may have some other things that are quite large, but these are the two that matter. The world, which God did not create, the world has to be some kind of eternal, infinite thing, places external limits on what God can do. So the world isn't God's creation, it's this place where he works. Creation, if there is anything like creation, it has to be either ex nihilo, according to some, or from pre-existing matter. But frankly, the finite Godists don't deal with this. Fourth, the world operates primarily by natural law, and that natural law is a part of the evolved, uncreated world. Miracles, therefore, never occur. And anybody who claims that miracles occur, like the Bible, is obviously wrong. 6, man is created, whatever that means, and may survive death, but you never know. Evil, of course, limits God, because evil is a part of the given. It's a part of the background noise, and God is doing the best he can. And 8, ethics are enduring, but they're not absolute. So ethics last a long time. They're helpful, they're useful in human life, but don't count on them. God has revealed no absolutes. So individuals must either come to their own conclusions about right and wrong or accept somebody else's conclusions. And finally, human destiny is uncertain. It's an uncertain world, and you never know what's going to happen next. There are no promises. And don't expect anything to be helpful. Okay. Okay, does finite Godism do anything for us? Well, not a whole lot, but we can say a couple of nice things before we move on to the critique. This is a realistic approach to evil. It's better to admit that evil exists than to deny evil. And so Rabbi Kushner and his friends have recognized that evil really exists. Secondly, there are in fact limitations on the divine power. Whatever we mean by the term omnipotent, and we rightly use the term omnipotent, it cannot mean that God can do anything. He can't do what is logically impossible. God cannot make square circles, for example. God cannot sin, just by definition. God cannot do literally anything. He has the power to do everything that is logically possible. As long as there are free human beings, however, there will be some evil in the world. So that is a self-limitation on God. So they've got parts of that right. Then thirdly, there is a need for man to struggle against evil. Throughout our lives, we need to struggle against sin in our own lives and in the lives of those around us and in the results of the lives of those around us. So in Calcutta, Mother Teresa fought against poverty. She did what she could for dying people in an astoundingly hostile environment. We can only admire that effort. Whether that resulted in Mother Teresa's salvation or not is something else. I'd like to think that she trusted Christ, but she was obviously a good person. We need more good people, whether or not they are Christian. The struggle against evil is always a good thing. So the finite Godists are good. So William James and Rabbi Kushner are on the right track. Being good is always better than being bad. But that isn't much praise for finite Godism. Let's look at some criticisms. One, this is a logical issue. A finite God would need a cause. Anything that has a beginning needs a cause. Anything that's finite has a beginning. So we have to ask the question, who created God? And whoever it was that created God deserves worship as God. It gets a little crazy, but it's the old question of the infinite series. If God is merely the latest in a long series of finite gods, then why should we bother with him? Why not worship the God who created all of this? Secondly, a finite God is not worthy of worship. The term worship involves ascribing ultimate value to one who is worthy of that ascription. A finite God is not worthy of worship. He's just one more low-achieving creature out on the landscape. And maybe we should respect him for what he's trying to do, but that doesn't rise to the level of worship. Thirdly, this is going to be very important. Evil does not eliminate an infinite God. The atheists, the deists, now the finite Godists argue that because there's evil in the world, God can't be the God of the Bible. And it may be true that there's evil in the world, and it may well be true that God has not yet eliminated it. But that word yet really needs to be added to the phrase. God has not yet eliminated evil, but that doesn't mean that he has no purpose to eliminate evil. Matter of fact, that is precisely the message of the Bible. The rejection of the biblical revelation is what gives us this dilemma. And fourthly, by what standard do we measure God? By my own relative, imperfectly evolved standard of good and evil? Is that it? Is there some absolute moral law beyond this finite God? If then, the lawgiver who made that law is God, not this little finite God that the good rabbi proposes. Fifthly, the concept of a limited God poses a dilemma. Here it is. If God cannot destroy evil because of external limits placed on him, then who placed those limits on him? Only an eternal, uncreated, infinite being could do that. Okay, so if God is limited, whoever it is that placed those limits on him has to be eternal, uncreated, infinite, all-powerful, all-knowing, and good. That would be God. So even proposing a limited God demands an unlimited God. And then sixthly, the uncertainty over the outcome of evil limits the motivation of the whole thing. There's no way to know how this is going to work out. Why should I try? If the standard for good and evil is my own subjective feeling, then why should I try? Just to make myself feel better? That's fairly weak motivation. Maybe I would feel better just staying home and having ice cream and let Calcutta deal with its own problems. So there are, I think, valid criticisms of finite godism. It's a remarkably widespread and extremely popular viewpoint. Most people don't know that it is called finite godism. They would call it something else. They would say that they're agnostic, or some would call themselves theistic atheists or something like that. For the most part, this is a position which is held by people who haven't thought about it much, but have found a book or two that they thought was encouraging. Kind of a spiritual book that makes them feel better. But they're wrong. They need to get into a spiritual book that actually can solve their problems. When we begin looking at the answers to these questions, as we begin studying apologetics, we're going to see that as Christians, we have good answers to the problem of evil. We have good definitions of God, and a careful understanding of the Bible does in fact give us the basis for making these claims. So let me get out of this. Let's see if I can find where's my cursor? There it is. We'll stop the share and we'll talk. Okay, guys, I'm going to unmute everybody. But I want to hear you again. It's good to see everybody. Thank you for coming back. It's nice to have the group together again. I hope that August was good there in Italy. I like August in Italy. Lots of blue skies, good days to go for picnics. But one of these days we'll be back. We'll see you all. Don and Oscar, thank you for waking up in the middle of the night. I really appreciate it. I appreciate seeing everybody again. So God bless. We'll see you next week. We'll be looking at one last worldview, the worldview of polytheism, the belief that there are many, many, many gods, and even the belief that you too can become the first kid on your block to be the god of his own individual world. Yes, indeed. There's a religion that teaches that, and we'll introduce it next week. It's not quite as hilarious as it sounds, but close. Okay. God bless everybody. Love you all. We'll
Dr.
see you.
John.
Thank you, Dr. Jan.
Bye bye, guys.
Thank you, Dr. John.
Grazie.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye
Dr.
bye.
Jan.
See you next
God
week.
bless. Bye bye.
Okay.